In this tutorial, you'll be learning how to create this typing test game. So here we go, we're going to start the game now. It works like this. I will fast forward till when the game's over. It lasts for a minute. Okay, so my score is 75 words per minute, not bad, but I could have done better. I've done better in the past. Anyway, it doesn't matter. There are different styles of typing test games. The one currently on YouTube, what they use is they use some APIs somewhere, and they also use preset sentences. As you can see, R1, the sentence, well, there's no sentence, it's just a list, a never-ending list of randomly generated English words. It's based off this style typing test here, so no preset sentences. The words come from a database which we created ourselves from this list of the 3,000 most common words in English. We put it into a Sql database which we then fetch every time we refresh the page. So if this interests you, then stay tuned and keep watching. Okay, so we just got VS Code open up on a blank project folder. The first file that we create is the index.html file, and we use exclamation mark to set up a boilerplate HTML code in VS Code. We'll call the title, we'll say typing test tutorial. In the head, we will create a new line and we will require the style sheet, which we'll create shortly. The rel will be style sheet. And the href will be, we'll call the file styles with a plural s.css. We'll open up the body now and we'll write a comment because we will have two script files just to abstract things out of it. So we'll say scripts do not touch. Scripts need to be the last thing that are loaded in the document object model. It's very important that they are. Otherwise we risk making references to elements that aren't rendered yet. The source, the first script, this is important that this script comes first because the following script uses content from the preceding script. We'll call the first script textbox.js and the aforementioned below script, we'll call it timer.js. Once we've done this, we can set up the style sheet, so we'll say styles.css. The first thing that we do when we open up a new style sheet is we remove the browser's default margin and padding. We do this on all elements as indicated by the star selector, and we'll set all elements to use box sizing border box. This is just standard practice that you should be using in every project. The addition that we'll make is we will set the font family to be a nice sans serif font. VS Code has already bundled in some font sequences here for us. The one that we will use is Arial Helvetica sans serif, which is a standard sans serif font. And we'll change the background color of the body to be a light grey color. Its hex value will be F2 repeated 3 times, like so. We'll go back to our markup now and we will open up live server just to make sure that the background has been created. Yeah, it has. As you can see, it's not plain white like it normally is by default. So we'll go back to our markup. The first element in the body will be a section. We'll create it like so. It will just have placeholder text saying 1 minute for now. We'll give it an ID. Timer text will be the ID. The ID will be very useful when we're creating references to it when we get to the JavaScript file. Below that we'll create another section. It will also have an ID. Its ID will be test box, like so. Inside we will create a div. This div will hold the text content inside the text box, which acts as a sort of container for the text. It will have an ID as well, test box. Text will be its ID. Keep in mind that we're using what's called kebab case to write out these IDs. Below this text box section, we will create a form because we'll be needing input of type text, so we'll create that input. It's a self-closing tag, remember. Its type will be text and its ID will be write-box. And below this form we will finally create another section. We'll put another line break just to separate things out because this section won't actually be displayed until the very end, till the timers run down to 0. and the game is over, we'll give it an ID of score, and we will create two paragraphs elements. The first paragraph element will say you scored and then a colon, and then the second one will be, it will need an ID because you need to create references to it in the JavaScript file. It will be score words per minute. Inside we'll just use the placeholder words per minute. Again, this will be adjusted based on the user's actual score. This is just placeholder text, 60 words per minute. We go back to our live server HTML file. As you can see, this needs styling immediately. So we'll go to our style sheet. The first thing that we will style is the timer text ID. So we'll use a hashtag to signify the ID that we're styling an ID. We'll say timer text. We'll give it a margin, horizontal margins to top and bottom will be 20 pixels, and it will be a font size. We'll say use 4EM. So the default font size of the font decided by the browser, multiply that by 4, and then we will get the end result. And we'll say text align, we'll set that to center. So it will be centered in the middle because remember it's a block element by default, which is 100% the width of the document. So text line center will have the text in the complete center of the document. Well, horizontal center anyway, not vertical. Now we will do the test box. So write it out like that. Its width will say 90% of the document, but its max width will be 1400. So on all screen sizes smaller than 1400 in width, it will be 90%, but on all screen sizes that have a wider width, it will be 1400 pixels, which is just a static value. And we'll do a similar thing for the height. We'll say height, we'll say 30 viewing height, it's 30, and then we'll say max height, that will be 500 pixels. We want the edges to be rounded a bit, so we'll say border radius 5 pixels. The border itself will be as thin as it can be, so that will be 1 pixel solid, and we'll set its color to be gray. The background color of the container itself will be white. Margin, we will say 0 vertical, but we want it to be centered horizontally in the document, so we'll say auto if it's horizontal values. Overflow will be hidden, which is how we achieve the text scroll effect, because it acts as a mask, this container. We'll set the font size to be 1.8 EM, and then we'll set the line height. These values have already been configured earlier by me. We'll say 65% because it looks nice, and you combine this with padding of 15 pixels. So the text, which we haven't created yet, will be away from the edges of the container by 15 pixels. From this, we will style that div inside of the text box section. So we'll say test box text, and then we'll open it up, and then we'll set it font family. It won't use a sans serif font family, it will use just a normal serif font. So we'll use this sequence starting with Georgia and ending with serif. Now below this we will style, we haven't created the span elements inside the text box text yet, but each word inside the text box text div will be its own span element. This is so we can add that background which is given to every word that the user needs to type out accurately. So what we'll do, we'll say test box text, and then we will target the span inside the test box text div. We'll say font family, we want it to inherit, so it will be the serif font families. Border radius, we'll slightly round it off a little bit by 3 pixels, not 5, sorry. And we'll give it some padding as well, and it will be 5 pixels all the way around. Now on the span, we want to give it a current word. We want to create a current word class which will be applied to the word that the user needs to type out accurately. So to distinguish it from the other words, we will give it a background color of a grayish color, which will be D 6 times. That will be its hex value. Now we will style the form. Its width will be 100% the width of the document. It will be display flex because we need to center it, the input inside of the form. And to do that, we will do justify content, and we'll center the input by doing justify content center. Now, if you remember, the input text had an ID called whitebox, as you can see, whitebox. So we will target that div here. We gave it an ID because we will be targeting it in the JavaScript file when we get around to that, and ID makes it a lot easier to target it. We'll say font family again inherit. So at the moment it will inherit that sans serif font family which we applied to all elements at the start. Its font size will be 1.5 EM. Padding will be 20 pixels, so there'll be a bit of space between the text and the edges of the input text. Its width will be 80% that of the document, and that needs to be a colon, not a semicolon. It will set the max width, so we're doing that same trick again. So make it look good on all different screen sizes of 1000 pixels. It will set the margin, we'll say 5 viewing height top, so it changes based on how long the viewport is. Right to be auto, bottom will be 0, and then left will be auto. Its min height, again we're doing that trick, it will be 75 pixels. And its height will be 15 viewing height, to contrast to its max height. We'll set the background color, will be white. The border radius will round it up a bit so it looks nice. We'll set that to be 5 pixels. The border itself will be 1 pixel, solid black to make it contrast from the white background. And we'll also give it a box shadow to distinguish from the main container. It'll be 0 offset X, 0 offset Y, 20 pixels blur, minus 10 pixels spread to bring it back in a bit, and then we'll say black will be the color. And we'll set outline to be none to remove that faint grey border that some browsers give the input text when we click on them. We don't want that because it looks kind of ugly. And final thing that we will style will be the score container, and it won't even be visible until the very end when the user completes the game. So to make it so it's not invisible, we'll set the display to be none. So currently it won't be visible on document load. We'll set the margin offset from the element above it by 60 pixels, and then we'll say auto so it's centered horizontally in the middle of the document. We'll say text align. Well, it contains paragraph elements and we want them to be centered, so the text itself is centered in the document, not just a container. And we'll set the font size, this paragraph element, to be 4 EM, so 4 times the default size of text. So now when we go to our document, as you can see, this is looking good, there's no text in here. I'll give you a quick demonstration of what the text in here will look like. So we'll go up to our test box text. We'll create a span element, because remember I said all words will be rendered in span elements, 1 span element for each word. And we'll just say current without a capital. This is what it will look like. We will copy this a couple more times. Now span elements are inline, so it will be formatted properly, and it will also go on a new line, but I won't copy that many. You just have to trust me on that until we get to the part where we dynamically render out the words from the SQL database. And now we will give it the class of, what is the class called again? We called it current word. So this is what the word will look like, the word that the user needs to type out accurately. It's just a visual indicator. So yeah, it's got this greyish border around it, so the user knows which word they need to focus on. We'll remove these span elements for now because I've given you a demonstration. What we need to do now is we need to set up the backend for the project. So we will go to our root project folder inside the file explorer, and we will open up a terminal. I've already got one loaded up from when I started the project, so I'll just open it up like this. And I'll type in npm init, and then I have the Y flag. So hyphen then Y to autocomplete yes for everything. Once I've done this, I'm going to create a new folder, call it public. Inside this, I am going to drag my styles into there so we can, I drag it in like that, so we can add styling to our index.html file. Regarding this, actually, we will rename it to .ejs because we'll be using, what it stands for is embedded JavaScript structure to render out the words retrieved from a SQL database inside the test box container. From there, we'll also need to create a new folder, and that will be called views, which is the default EJS folder name, and we will drag the index.ejs into there. Now outside all these folders, we will create the server file, so we'll call it server.js. And what we need to do actually, we need to install 3 dependencies. We will install, so we'll type in npm I is short for install in Node Package Manager. We will say express space MySQL, and the final one will be FS, which stands for file stream. So we'll install those dependencies like so. So once they're installed, we can go back to our server.js, and we will create references to those dependencies. So we'll say const express equals require express, and we'll do the same for file stream. So the const will be called just simply fs to match the name of the dependency, which we'll link to like so, and the const will also create a MySQL const, and we'll acquire the relevant package name. Below this we will create a connection to MySQL. So before we do that, we need to open up XAMPP. So I've already opened it up, and we will start the first two options, Apache and MySQL. This will allow us to start a connection to MySQL. So we will say create connection. By the way, if you haven't installed that, I'll post a link in the comments to where you can install that. So I'll create a const called db, and it will equal to MySQL.create connection method. Host by default is 127.0.0.1 unless you specified otherwise, and user by default is simply root, and by default there's no password unless you added one yourself. I personally haven't, so I don't need to add one. And below this we'll we'll say connect, and we'll do the relevant code. So we'll say db.connect. Inside we have callback, which takes an error as the arguments. If there is an error, we want to see the error, so we'll simply throw it. And if not, then we will say console.log MySQL connected, like so. Below this we can initialize the app, so we'll say init app, so we can separate things out into sections. Const app equals express will be the first statement that we write out. Below this we will set the app to use EJS, which we haven't actually, oh yeah, we need to install the EJS dependency actually, so npm I EJS, I did forget that one. So once it's installed we will say view engine, and then in the second argument we'll say EJS as a string. And below this we'll need to declare the static folder so we can apply styling and scripts to our EJS file. So I say app.use, use this time, not set, express.static public, because remember public's the name of the folder where our static files are contained. Currently the only file that we got in there is the style sheet, but we'll add in more later on. Below this we'll need to set up our application to handle JSON data, so we'll say express.json, and we'll also say app.use express.url encoded, extended equals true, so it's able to handle more data types than just strings and arrays. Now below all this we will set the app to listen on port 3000, so app.listen 3000. A second argument will be a callback function, which simply says, it simply logs to the console, server has started on port, in all caps, 3000. And now before we start the server, we're going to create a script just so we can start it easily using NodeMon. If you haven't installed NodeMon, then I would suggest you do, and you install it globally as well, so it will be available for all projects. We will change the main file to server.js because that's what it's called, it's not called app.js. And the script will be called start, and its value will be NodeMon server.js. So now all we need to do to start application would be go to our terminal, and then we'll say npm run start, and as you can see it started. We successfully connected to MySQL as indicated by the string and the fact that an error hasn't been thrown, which is good. What we need to do now is we need to go back to that website that I mentioned at the start. Again, I'll post a link to it in the description just in case you can't find it. We'll click towards the left of the A and we'll scroll all the way down. Then we will hold down shift and click to the right of zone. So this will select all of the words currently on this page, which is 3000. And we will click Control C. Well, sorry, hold down Control and then C. And then we will open up Notepad and paste all the words into here. So as you can see, it's 3000 lines and each word's on a new line, so they were telling the truth. From there we will say file save as, and we will save to our root project folder. So I'll just copy the location here, the absolute location, and we'll paste it in here. and we'll simply say, we'll call it words, nothing fancy. As you can see, it's saved in here, not in the static folder or any of that, just in the absolute root of the project. So now we can close this. So now that we've got our words.txt file, which you can see here in our root project folder, we can begin to create the SQL database. So we'll create a root to do this, and we will just call it, this endpoint will be just simply /setup, and we'll open up the callback function. Inside we will store the SQL command or query into a variable called SQL, and the query will be create database, and we'll call it typing test db, very simple. And then we'll use the query method on the db object, and we'll pass in the command that we just created, and its callback will have the arguments, the error and the result. Open it up like so. If there is an error, then we'll simply throw the error because we need to see what it is. But if not, then we will send success like so. So we'll access to this route now. We will go to setup, and as you can see, it's saying success. So now if you go to phpMyAdmin, we can see the typing test DB has been created. Just ignore typing test for now, that was created previously. To access phpMyAdmin, you go to simply localhost /phpMyAdmin like so. I already loaded it up previously, which is why I was just able to go on it. So once we've created the database, we need to connect MySQL to that database which has just been created. So for its database field, we'll type in the database, which is typing test db. So yeah, like I said, we'll create the table. So we'll say create table, we'll call it words, and it will have a field called ID, which will be type integer. The modifier will be auto increment, so it's perfect for usage as a primary key. The only other column that we'll have is word column, and that will be variable character, 255 characters long. And then we'll say primary key and ID, well, not capital, the ID column will be the primary key. So now we'll change the send message. We'll keep the query the same, but we'll change the success message just to distinguish it out from the previous query. We'll say created table. So now we go back, we can see if our server's running still. It is, and we will refresh, and it says created table, so we should be able to see that table now if we refresh phpMyAdmin. Yep, it has been created, these two columns here. So what we need to do now is we will change this query to insert data. So we'll delete all this. We'll say insert into words, not caps, words, and we will target the word field because we need to insert values into the word field. Value and then question mark, or values, sorry, because we're inserting multiple data. What we will do now is we need to read from the file. So we will say fs.read file, not read file sync, and we'll target the words.txt file, which we inserted our words into. So we'll say words.txt. The second argument will be the encoder that we're using, which is UTF-8. And then the third argument will be the callback function. So the two arguments are error and data. So if there's an error, then we'll need to see that error. But else, we can simply log data to see if we are getting back the data. I'll comment this out for now. So I'll just refresh this route, and then I'll see what if we're getting back any data, and we are getting data, we're getting all the words. The problem with this is it's not formatted properly to be inserted into a SQL table. So what we need to do is, first of all, we need to create an array where each item in the array contains an individual word from the text file. So what we'll create a new variable, we'll call it words equals data.split, and its split will be a regular expression, and we will split on, oh by the way, you do 2 forward slashes to create a regular expression. Inside we will sandwich \r and then \n, and this will split the data every time there's a new line. So now words will consist of an array where each item will be split on the point where there's a new line. meaning that it will contain an array where all the words are individual items in the array. The other thing that we'll need to do is we need to actually put each word into its own array to create a nested array. This is simply the SQL formatting for inserting multiple rows into a table. So we'll say let nested words equals words.map. Inside will be word, we'll use that as the iterator, and then we'll just say return an array containing word, and now we'll log nested word just to see if it's working correctly. We'll refresh this, refresh it again. We'll go back to we click refresh, restart like that, and as you can see this is working properly. All the different words are in its own array. So the final thing that we need to do, what we'll do is that we'll click stop refresh on that because it might mess things up. We will bring this into the callback function. It's very important that this is actually inside the callback function because we don't want to make the query unless we have read the data and we've formatted it properly. What we'll say is the placeholder, this question mark is a placeholder, and instead of the question mark we will use nested words inside an array. The array tells SQL that nested words needs to be inserted as multiple rows into the table. We'll change the res.send to inserted data. So now we can restart our server, and then we can go back to this route for one final time, refresh, insert the data, which is a good sign. We refresh phpMyAdmin, and now as you can see, we've inserted every single, whoops, I don't want to do that. So I'll bring it back like that. As you can see, we've inserted every single word into our SQL database. There are many different pages, you can look at them if you want. They're all alphabetically ordered, but that doesn't matter to us. So now that this is done, we can actually delete this route entirely, the setup route, because we don't need it anymore. So now that we've inserted all the words that we need into our SQL table, the next step would be to render out those words onto our index.ejs file. We're not going to render out all of the words because that would simply be too long and pointless because nobody actually is going to see all of those words. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a function which will retrieve 500 random words from our SQL table, and then it will actually display them or send them to the index.ejs file, which will then be rendered inside of the container using AJS code snippets. So what we'll do is we will call the function, we'll call it sort words. We'll have an argument of unfiltered words, which will contain all of the data from all of the word columns from our words table. The first thing that we'll do is we will create an empty array, we'll call it word store. Then we will create a loop, it will run for 500 iterations. So we can say I less than 500 and I plus plus. Because I starts at 0, it will run for 500 iterations. Then we will generate a random number each iteration. So we'll say math.floor, and then we'll say math.random times by 3000. So this will generate a random number that relates to the index of the unfiltered words array. So there's 3000 words, and because base indexing, the index will be between 0 and 2999, which is all the possible combinations of this random index number. The next thing that we'll do, we'll push the random number generated to the word store array. Actually, no, we will push the unfiltered words, the index of the random index, and then we will push the randomly selected word to the word store. And then the function will simply return a word store, like so. And what we need to do now is we need to make the query to actually get all of the words from the words table. So outside the app.get, because I just want to see whether it works or not before I actually do it, we'll say let SQL equals select word. Remember, that's the name of the column, from words, the name of the table. And then we'll say db.query, pass in the SQL query. The callback function will be the error and the result, as it always is. If there's an error, then we'll throw error, else we will console.log result. So we'll see what result looks like. then when we start a server. So as you can see, we've already got it back because NodeMon restarts automatically. And what I wanted to show you was this word field, which Sql automatically creates for us. So what we're going to do is we're going to tap into this word field, because each item in the array is actually an object which does contain the word, but it contains the word in the word field, so we actually need to access that field. This is the reason why I did this outside of the endpoint. I just wanted to show you that that was what was going on there. So we'll cut that and we will put it back into our default route like so. So it'll be triggered when the user tries to access the default route. And what we'll do is below console.log result, we will say let word store equal sort words, and it will take in the result, so the data queried from a SQL database. And then below this, finally, we will say now render the EJS file. We'll copy this res.render, we'll paste it in there, and we will render it with a variable which is available in EJS. We will call it word store, and it takes in word store as its value. So now in the EJS file, we can use this word store field. So we'll say inside of this test box text div, we will include a code snippet, which is less than sign %, and then the end tag will be % greater than sign. We'll say word store, because that's the name of the field, for each, and we'll say word. So word will be the individual items of the array, which is word store. If you remember, it's an array which will contain randomly selected words from the SQL database, and it will contain 500 of them. Each line needs to contain these opening and closing snippets. So we will put that on the bottom line, and we'll close off the top line as well. Inside this, we will say span, so render out a span element for each iteration, and the contents of the span will be that. We will include a hyphen here to show that we want a variable content rendered out, and the variable content is word, like so. So now when we go to our root endpoint, we'll remove that because that no longer exists anymore. Okay, word store is not defined, so we're going to restart our server. And I'll restart it like so, and now yeah, it's working, because as you can see, this text has been rendered out. We can refresh and it should be different each time, because 500 words have been randomly selected and then been rendered out, and each word is in a span element. The reason why we selected 500, nobody's going to be able to type out 500 words in a second. That's physically impossible, it's just not going to happen. Obviously, if it is possible, all you can do is just increase the number of words, the number of random words sent over to our EJS file, just by increasing the number of iterators in the loop. One thing that I've noticed is this text box error. This height was meant to be max height, not simply height like that. So now it can't be any greater than 15 viewing height. So when we refresh now, it is slimmer, which is what we want it to be. And yeah, each time we refresh, actually it's containing new words. This is exactly the kind of behavior that we want. So now it's time to do the JavaScript files. To start off with, we are going to go to this input, and we will put it on a new line, and we will give it an onKeyUp event handler. The reason why onKeyUp is because we want the onKeyUp event handler will be triggered when the user releases the key, which is good because we want the letter to be visually rendered first before we activate this function to prevent any errors. We will call it input type, and we'll pass in the element itself into the event handler. Then we will create inside of the public folder, because remember that's our static folder. We'll create the new file. We'll say testbox.js, and we'll create the other one as well, timer.js. That's what they're called. We'll go into the timer one first, and we'll create that function, that input type function. And remember, it takes in the input element itself, so we say input as its argument. Then we'll open it up. Then we will say let text input equals input.value. So the value of the input is whatever text the user types into the input. So if we log this, and then we go to our console, you can see that every time we release a key, this updates with what we type in relation to what we typed into this input or type text. So now that you know what this is, we can delete it, because what we're actually going to do is we are going to create a function that's going to start this timer off, because this needs to be started when the game starts. Well, it needs to start counting down anyway. So we will create a function and it will say start. It will be called start timer. It will take in 2 arguments. The first is the duration in seconds, and the second is the element that it needs to target. We'll actually specify a comment so we know what we're doing. We'll say start the timer, and we will say let timer equals duration. Actually, before we continue with this, we will just say we'll go back to the testbox.js, and we need to create a boolean, because it's also used in this file, and this JavaScript file comes first before the timer JavaScript file. So we'll be able to access the data in text box inside a timer, so it's fine. We can declare it in the test box JavaScript file. And we will actually create a few lines above this, and we will create a new boolean. We'll call it, say, game start equals false, because when it's instantiated, the game's obviously not started yet. Above that, actually, we'll also say let timer text. We'll create a reference to the timer text, so document.get element by ID. Timer text, which is the ID of the text, which just displays 1 minute at the moment, but obviously that's hard coded in. So now in this input type event handler function, which gets called, remember, on key up, whenever the keystroke is released, we'll say if game start is false. So if the game hasn't started, then we need to start the game, so we set it to true. So the game is now started, and then we'll say start timer. We'll pass in 60 seconds, 1 minute, and timer text is the element. And then below that, we will also instantiate 2 more local scope variables. It will be minute, first one, and the other one will be seconds. We'll create it like that. Now we'll need to create a repeating function using the set interval method, and we'll assign it to a variable called tick, and we'll say set interval like so. Open up the callback, and we will repeat this function every 1000 milliseconds, in other words, every second. First thing that we'll do in this set interval callback function, which gets repeated, we'll say we pass int, because in the section below we append a string to the number value. Again, this will make more sense later on, but I'm writing this now just for future reference so things aren't so complicated. What we'll do, we'll say minute equal pass int, because it might be changed to a string value later on, so it needs to be changed back to a numerical value at the moment, so we can do calculations on it. We'll say timer, which is, remember, the durations. At the moment it will be 60, just the number 60, divided by 60. So at the moment that will be 1, so 1 minute, and then seconds will be parseInt timer percentage 60. This percentage is the modulus operator, and it calculates the remainder of timer divided by 60. So at the moment that'll be 60 divided by 60, which is 1. So no remainder, so it will be, seconds will be 0. But if timer was 59, for instance, then the remainder would be 1. So seconds would be 1. So this percentage stands for the modulus operator, which is the remainder of whatever timer is divided by 60. So if timer was 59, then 59 divided by 60. The remainder of that is passed to an integer. So integers is only 4 numbers. So that would just be 59. This allows us to count down in seconds when we decrement the value of timer. Below this, we will say format the timer properly. So we're not going to format the minutes, but obviously if seconds is less than 10, then we want to actually prepend a 0 to it. So it always displays 2 digits, even if its value is just 5, in which case it will say 05. So how we're going to achieve this is we'll say seconds equals seconds. If seconds is less than 10, we'll use the ternary operator here. So if that is true, then we will say the string 0. Okay, this is where the string comes from. So when we repeat the function, you want to pass integer because we want to remove this string basically. So it won't be a string value anymore. We'll say plus seconds, so we prepend the 0 to seconds. Else we'll just, if it's greater than 10, so obviously we don't need to do that. So we'll just return seconds as it is because it's fine as it is. What we need to do now is we'll need to append these minutes and seconds to the element, which in our case is the text input in the correct format. So we'll say le.text content equals minutes. We'll append that colon to it so it's formatted in the correct time formatting, plus seconds as so. And now this is the important part, we'll need to decrement timer so it goes down every second because remember we specified the set interval to repeat every 100 milliseconds, which is a second. So now we'll post a new comment, we'll say if timer goes below 0 then game end. So if timer is less than 0, in other words, if it already was 0 and it's been decremented one more time and so now it's -1, then we don't want the callback function to repeat again in this instance because then it will just go into minus numbers and we don't want that. So we'll say clear interval and record the set interval function tick, so we'll clear that so it no longer repeats. And when we'll say le.text content, we'll just say set it to equal end as so. So now when we go back to our default route, we'll just remove this actually. When we go back to our default route and then we check to see if our server's starting, we'll restart it just in case. And then we can type in some values here, and this should start now. So it starts at 1 minute and then it goes down as so, it just keeps on going down and it won't repeat because then we got this boolean. So once the game started, the set interval won't record again because if it was then it'll mess everything up. And it's counting down now, it's doing as it should, which is very good. We're not gonna wait for it to get into the lower 10 numbers so we can see that 0 appended. You just have to trust me that when we get to it, the 0 will be prepended to the seconds value, but it is working as so. What we'll need to do now, we'll go back to our JavaScript file and we'll create 2 more functions. These 2 functions will be actually used as event handlers in the actual, save this for a second because I can see we've got unsaved changes as indicated by that circle here. Yeah, so they'll be used as the event handlers in the input element, which is type text. So the first one will be when we focus in on the input. In other words, when we click on it, we'll call it on focus. And we'll write a comment so we know what we're doing. We'll say on focus, useful for test box file. The reason why we're creating them now is because we'll be moving on to the testbox.js file shortly. And what we'll do, actually in that file, we'll create a global variable called letIsFocus, and it will be set to false because obviously on document load, it won't actually be, it's impossible for us to click on the input when it's just loaded. But when we do click on it, then we'll set on focus, we'll set that to be true. And we'll create another event handler, which will be on blur. So the blur event will be triggered when the user clicks off of the input, so it's no longer focused. And because it's no longer focused, we'll set the isFocused boolean and we'll set that to be false. And now we need to add these event handlers to the input element on our EJS file. So we'll create some space here, we'll create some new lines. And then we'll give it its onFocus attribute, and then we'll pass in that method that we just created. OnFocus doesn't need any arguments, and we'll do the same for the onBlur event. Pass in that method that we just created on blur. As so, that's good now. Now we can go to our testbox.js file. And below where we created the isFocus boolean, we will create a new comment and we'll say every time the user releases a keystroke. So this will be a window.add event listener. The event that we want to listen to is keyup. So this event in the callback, which we'll create, we'll say event. Open up the callback as follows. So this callback function will be triggered every time the user releases a key press anywhere on the document. So not related, this is not related to the input element specifically. This could just be anywhere on the document. And above this, we will actually create a reference to the input text element just so we can get its value. We'll say get element by ID. and then we'll say right box, because remember that was its ID. If we go back here, we can see it's right box. Now that we've created a reference to it, we can go to our timer.js file. We'll create a new comment and we'll say set input text to be blank on page refresh. So we can say input text dot value equals just empty string. Remember that we can access all of the content of our textbox.js inside a timer.js file, but not the other way around. This is because the timer.js file is declared below the textbox.js file in our HTML markup. So now when we type in some content here and then we refresh the page, on page refresh this has been deleted now, which is the behavior that we want. So now we will type a new comment and we'll say if the most recent key pressed was a space, and in if statement we can detect whether or not they pressed the space key by saying event.code equals space with a capital P, and we'll also say and is focus. So if they are currently focused in on the input text box and they press the space key, it's important for that boolean to be involved, because otherwise they'll be able to skip to the next word without even pressing on the text input, which would be weird behavior. So what we'll do now is we'll say let word store equals input text dot value, and we'll say input text dot value dot trim. We use the trim method because the text contained in the spam elements, they might have white space, extra white space that's unneeded. So we'll use the trim method to remove any extra white space. We need to remove the white space because we'll be comparing it with the inputted word, which won't have any white space in it. So it's very important that we use the trim method. And then after this, we'll also say the input text will change its value to back to nothing. So when they press the space key, we will reset the text currently inside of the input text element. And now we will increment the current word, but we haven't, this is actually contained in a global variable, which we need to create if we haven't done that yet. So we'll create a comment and we'll say the currently targeted word, and below this we'll say let current word number, and we'll set it equal to 1. And then we can increment current word number, we can increment that like so. So now we can test this out, and we will go to our local server and we can just type in any words, we press space, and as you can see it's working as we want it to. So when we press space, it resets the text contained in the input element, which is good, it's what we want. What we need to do now is we're going to create a function. We will call this function, we'll call it select this word. We'll pass in the current word number, and we're also given the word store, like so. Obviously I just said we need to create this function, so we'll do it down below. I'll write the comment, I'll say give the currently selected styling to this word. So remember that current word class that we give the currently selected span element to change its background color. So they use as a visual indicator of the word that they need to be typing out properly. So we will create the function like so, pass in its necessary arguments. Current word number, we'll call that one, and the second one will be called word store. We'll keep the names the same just for consistency. We'll create a comment, we'll say need to remove previous word once game has started. So what we'll do, we'll create a reference, we'll say prev word, also an unassigned variable, and we'll say if current word number is greater than 1. So if the word number has been incremented at least one time, then what we're going to do, we will assign prev word to document.query selector, and what we'll do, we will target an individual spam element inside the text box text ID. If you remember, we'll say test box text to target that, and to target the span element inside of it, nested inside, we'll say span. And to target a specific span child of the test box text, we will use the nth child pseudo class. Whoops, like that. Actually, we'll remove these, we'll use backticks, so it's easier, the string interpolation's a lot easier. And inside we will open the parentheses, close it like that, and we use a $sign, and then we will say current word number -1. So basically what this is doing, we're targeting the span element that was previous to the child of this one. So we need to, the reason why we're doing this is because we need to remove the styling because it's no longer the currently selected span element. So if this is the first time that this function's being called, then current word number will currently be 2 and -1 will be 1. So this will target the very first span element inside the test box text element with the ID. So below this we will remove its class, the current word class that would have been applied to it previously. So we'll say set attribute, we will set its class to be nothing, like so. And then below this we will say let current word equals document dot query selector, and inside we'll copy this code here just for quick access, and we will delete this. So again, the first time this is run, or after it's run here, this will be, current word will be 2. So this will target the second span element inside the test box text element with the ID. And then what we'll do is we will set the current word, we'll say set attribute, and we'll set its class to be current word, like so. Now the problem with this is the very first span element needs to be the word that's first selected. So what we will do is we will go to the top of the document, and below where we declared the current word number variable, we'll say select this word, and we will pass in current word number, like so. So now when we go to back to our document, we refresh. As you can see, this first word, because we called it up here, it's been given the current styling. And then when we say best, because as you can see, look at this now, obviously it's not based on what words we're typing into text, but every time you press space, as you can see, it's moving along. This is the behavior that we want. So what we'll do now is we'll actually write a comment below this first just to clear things up. We'll say only allow new word if user is focused on text box. Below this we will declare a reference to, we'll say test box text, we'll say to be moved up when on a new line. We'll say let test box text equals document.get element by ID, and we will declare a reference to the test box text element. We'll be using this for later when we want to move up the text when they are selecting a new line. And we'll say let minus margin top, we'll set that to be 0. And then we'll say score, this is the important one now. We'll say let user score. Obviously when the game starts you want it to be 0 because they haven't got any words spelled accurately yet. So inside if current word greater than, inside this block, so obviously they've moved on to a new word now. So we need to evaluate whether or not they spelt the previous word correctly. So we will call a function which we're going to create shortly. We'll call it should user score, and we'll pass in 2 arguments. We will pass in the word store, and then we will pass in the prev word. So we need to create this function, so we'll go on a new line, and then we'll write out a comment. We'll say should the user score a point or not, and the function will look like this. It will be should user score. We'll put in the user input. Second argument will be prev word. Again, we'll keep the name consistent. Actually, no, you won't. User input's different, but we know what it is. First thing that we'll do, we'll say let text value equals prev word dot text content. So we're getting the text content of the prev word, which will be evaluated against what they've typed into the input element. And then we'll write a comment. So we know what we're doing. We'll say green, success, red, fail. So we know the color indicators. So if user input is equal to text value. So if it's the same, then obviously they've got it right because it's the same, it's matching. So I'll say prev word dot style dot color equals green, and then we will increment user score. It's obviously got it right, so the score needs to go up. And then from this, else they obviously haven't spelled the word right, so we won't increment the score, and we'll set the prev word, we'll set the style and then the color of that to be, it'll be red to indicate that they spelled it incorrectly. So now we can test this out. We will say golden machine, although, and then we'll spell this wrong on Power BI. As you can see, this is working now. What we need to do now is, as you can see, if we go through this, we need to, the text needs to be moved up now when we're on a new line. So what we'll do is we will go back to our select this word function. We'll create a new comment. We'll say, is the user selecting a word on a new line? Question mark. And then we'll say if prev word. So if prev word has been instantiated. So basically, if they've moved on now from the very first word, we'll call a function which we need to create. We'll say if new line. Inside that we'll pass in prev word, and then we'll pass in the current word so we compare the positioning of both. And then we'll create that function. Function is new line. Again, give the argument names. We'll say prev word, and then the other one will be current word. Open that up like so, and then we'll say let prev word. We'll say rect, and then we'll say prev word dot get bounding client rect. This is a method that returns important positional information regarding the element that it's being applied to. And we'll do the same for the current word. So we'll say let current word rect equals current word dot, I'll just copy the method over from where I declared it before because it's quite verbose. And we'll say if the prev word rect dot top, if the top position is different from the current word rect, then obviously there's some discrepancy there. So obviously this new word is on a different line from the previous word. So what we'll do, we'll say minus margin top. We'll move it down, we'll decrement it by 65. This is the value that I found works good, because if you go back, we can actually see that the line height of the text, as you can see, it's 65. So we'll move the margin top by, the reason why we use minus margins. So normally when you add a positive integer onto a margin top, obviously it will move the element down. But if you give it a minus number, then it will do the opposite and move it down, which is move it back up. And then we will say text box text dot style. We need to apply the margin top value. So we'll say margin top equals minus margin top, and then we'll plus pixels so it actually works, and so it has a unit to work off of. So now when we play our game, okay, so I just tried this out and it's not working. So instead of boring you with me trying to debug the error, the reason why I got the error is because I said test box test when it needs to be test box text. So obviously it's trying to give a negative margin to an element which doesn't even exist. So now when we change that around to its real value and we try it now, we'll say y delete l delete maintain, and then as you can see, it's moving up now. So the final feature will be to do the end screen when the user's completed. So we'll do this back on the time.js file. And above where we declare the global variables, we'll say a comment and we'll say score values to be shown on game end. And we will declare references to the two elements with IDs that relate to the ending elements. So what I mean by this is these. So this section and this paragraph here, the one with score words per minute ID. So we'll say let score container equals document.get element by ID. And we'll say that's score, and then we'll say let score WPM capitals document.get element by ID, and we'll say score words per minute, make sure it's spelled correctly, And then inside this if statement, so if time is less than 0, we will say show the game over text, and then we'll say we'll call this method that we need to create, show game over. We'll create that method here. So we'll just say show game over function, show game over, open up like so, we don't need any arguments, and we'll say user can no longer type into input. So we'll say input text declared in the previous textbox.js file, and then we'll say disabled. We'll set that to equal true, so they can't type in it anymore because the input element has been disabled. And then we will declare reference to the current word, and we'll say document. Actually no, we'll just speed it up, you know what to do. We'll just copy this actually. We can't access the current word because it's a local variable, so we'll just paste it in like that to create a new reference to it. And we will remove its current word style, so we'll say set attribute class, and then that will just be nothing to remove its class values. And then we will say input text. We'll clear that out as well, we'll clear the value of it out. So there's now no longer any text inside the input. And then we'll say show score, so we'll say let words per minute. We'll do the calculation of the words per minute in this. We'll say math.round, and then double set of parentheses. We'll say user score divided by 60 in the first set of parentheses, and then the outer set we'll times that by 100, so we get a percentage effectively. And then we'll say score WPM, which is, remember, the paragraph element. We'll say text content of that will be words per minute plus, so we'll do string concatenation plus WPM. And then we'll say score content, because remember it's currently set to display none, so we'll set its display back to be block so we can actually see it this time. And that should finish off our application. So now I'll play. Okay, so rather than bore you with another error debug, I have noticed another error, and what we did was this clear interval, it says trick, but it should actually be tick. So obviously we spelt that wrong, and so obviously we can't clear an interval of a set interval which doesn't even exist. So now we'll play the game for the final time, just to make sure that everything's working, and I'll show you that we created it as such. So we'll play the game now. Obviously I do need some amounts of concentration when doing this, but it doesn't really matter what my score is, to be honest, because it's not a video where I'm trying to show off my typing ability. It's a tutorial. But obviously, as you can see, the game is working nicely. We can play it. Man, I'm getting a lot of words wrong here. But again, as I said, it doesn't really matter. Those words won't be accumulated into my final value. And as you can see, end, I still got a pretty decent word per minute score, despite my many words that I got wrong. As you can see, everything's stopped now. I can no longer click on this input element. And yeah, here's the game. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. As you can see, it's working perfectly. If you have any queries, then don't hesitate to post them down in the comments box below. I will be very happy to see any of your comments, and I will answer them to the best of my ability. And please like and subscribe. I put in lots of effort into making this video, and so any support on your end will be hugely appreciated. And peace out, have a good day, and I'll see you in the next one, guys. Peace out.